So the next video in this series of introductory videos to the basic service design methods is focusing on observation. But if you're just joining us in this series, or you've cut straight in at this point, it's maybe worth just recapping that we have started this process by looking at stakeholder mapping and how we can use a variety of different stakeholder mapping techniques to begin to brainstorm and think as broadly as possible about the types of users or the types of individuals, the types of people that we will likely meet in our context. And then following that, we have another video on user profiles, which is just the service design technique for summarizing in a slightly deeper way and in a slightly statistically informed or quantitatively informed way who those users are and what rough categories we can group those users in as we start to think more strategically or more in detail about what type of users are important to involve in this user-centered design process. And obviously in this method we're going to start to connect the activity that we're doing to this ambition that we have on the AEIOU project that we should go out and investigate a particular neighborhood in our local context. So we've felt that the best methods that we can offer from the service design library of methods to help understand users are observation, which we'll cover today, and that's also known as shadowing or connected to shadowing. And then we also have interviews, which we'll cover in a separate video. So that's very much the trajectory of travel. I should also add at this point that I have no prior experience of conducting a caring neighborhoods approach. So the thinking with these videos was instead that we would deliver a more conventional service design introduction, the sort of thing that we would cover with anyone who was wanting to learn how to conduct service design activity in a public sector context or in a social policy context. And that the parallels would be apt between doing so and then what we would have to do to conduct the neighborhood analysis. But obviously I would refer any questions about those exact distinctions to both myself but also to Gwen and Elise, who are leading the work package 4. And perhaps if there are those of you who either at this point or after you've seen this video want to understand some of the distinctions there, if there are any, or are confused perhaps about the difference between conducting a caring neighborhoods analysis and conducting a more conventional observational analysis, then that would be a great topic for us to discuss in the webinar on the 13th of May. But then for the purposes of this video today, please just assume that what we're talking about here is more typical service design activity. It's also perhaps worth saying that for any of you who come perhaps from a qualitative research background or indeed any form of research background, particularly in a social policy context, there'll likely be very little new in this presentation today. Service design as a discipline has drawn very heavily on social science in terms of informing its method. But what we'll cover today is an introduction to conducting a user observation in a typical service design oriented way, and hopefully that will help you all help structure the planning process for conducting the neighborhood analysis, with a little bit of a view about how we're going to also generate insights from that analysis process that could then lead to ideas that will help develop services or new products that will help tackle social isolation and loneliness in our respective contexts. So what then is observation? Observation is one of the core service design methods that we use to help us understand how people actually behave when they use our products and services. So it's basically a process that allows us to understand people's actual use of products and services And it's very useful also for surfacing hidden understanding about those users and about their behavior, things that might not be immediately obvious, but also very, very useful for challenging our own assumptions about how people behave or how people actually use our products and services. For those of you that have been following along with these videos and that have completed the user profiles video, you will have spent time reflecting, as we did in that video, on what our existing assumptions are as we begin this eye-to-eye project about who our users are, who are the people who are at risk of social isolation and loneliness in this particular case, and what it is of our knowledge that leads us to believe that, and indeed what we in our project teams actually understand already before we've begun the work or at the outset of this project, what it is we actually understand about those users. And observation is just one of the many methods that we can use to help challenge that assumption or challenge those assumptions and to build a richer picture of who our users are and how they actually use or consume the products and services that our organizations offer. So why is this important? Well, it's important because of the sort of fundamental aspect of human behavior that means that we're not always fully conscious of what we're doing ourselves. And the fact that you can ask people to rationalize or to explain how they do certain things or how they use a particular service or what's important to them as they use a particular product. But very often we're not very good. We don't have a particularly great self-awareness often about actually what we're doing. So we have an idea of what we're doing, but it's very often when you compare what people have said that they value or have said that they think is important or that people say that they do when you ask them to explain how they've done something. When you compare that with actually watching them do it, the two things very often don't match up. So observation then is a chance for us to watch people and to see what actually happens. This can be very, very useful, particularly once we have spent a bit more time understanding the problem, for focusing in at points that we already understand within our service delivery process that people either think are important or that people have problems with. And this again alludes to the sort of origins of service design as a discipline that grew up predominantly in the private sector around helping people to understand the services that their organizations deliver and to improve them. So again, observation, a very good technique when you know that certain aspects of your service delivery aren't working or aren't working as well as they could, because customers or people have told you that, but then you need to sort of understand why at a deeper level. Why is this not working? You can ask people, you can give them a questionnaire, but very often the answers that they'll give you are different in the questionnaire compared to if you actually go out and watch people. For our purposes here, obviously the neighborhood analysis as it's been proposed in the project so far has very much implicitly had an observational focus. In other words, whenever we've talked about conducting the neighborhood analysis, there's been this very strong idea that there will be an observational component to that. It's definitely possible you could look at the criteria around what constitutes a neighborhood analysis, and I repeat that I'm certainly no expert in what a caring neighborhoods approach is, but you can certainly read around that topic and understand that it could also be an interview. It could be conducting a more formal interview. And basically, as this presentation goes on, I will unpick, for those of you that aren't already aware, some of the differences between what constitutes an interview and an observation. But the two things are somewhat blurred in terms of a distinction between them. And in any case, what we're interested in here on the Eye-to-Eye project is conducting a neighbourhood analysis. But hopefully this presentation will help us begin to think about how we can plan and structure that activity. So our early work on this project and our work to date has given us a list of potentially people who we're interested in understanding more about. They could be people who, because we've specified a particular neighbourhood that we're interested in looking at, they're the people who live in that neighbourhood, or they're the people that work in that area. Or they could be people who we've pre-identified as having a heightened risk of social isolation and loneliness. So we're interested in observing them to understand more about who they are and how they live their lives. And therefore, in terms of our planning for this process, one of the most important things is that when we're thinking about going out and conducting the observation or conducting the neighbourhood analysis, that we're actually confident that those people are going to be there when we are. It's certainly not going to be possible for us to understand too much about people if, when we go out to observe them, they're not actually there themselves. And this obviously maybe gets at the heart of some of the differences perhaps in how partners on this project are planning to approach the observation, in terms of whether people think that they are simply going out on a given day in a given neighbourhood and seeing who they meet, taking a very organic approach to who the people are, but setting the boundary very much firmly in terms of which area they're interested in observing and which time they will be there to conduct that observation, versus those of us who maybe have a more concrete definition of which users we're interested in observing and understanding more about, and therefore potentially are willing to be more flexible about which area we observe and what time we are there to conduct that observation, because we are absolutely intent that we will meet those people or see those people. So with that potentially rather large difference in terms of how you might be sitting there yourselves reflecting on your plans for this neighbourhood analysis, or potentially with some of the differences between ourselves in this project in terms of how we're planning to approach it, I'm going to try and keep this video fairly general as to the different things you need to think about in conducting such an observation. You will obviously need to respond flexibly to some of the things that I'm saying, depending on what you've already decided to do. Those two distinctions, the ones we've just drawn, between those of us that are approaching this in a very physical or spatial way, that we know what physical or spatial area we're interested in, and the rest is very much what we're hoping to learn, is obviously a very big difference to those of us who've taken a much more user-centered approach of, we know what users we're interested in focusing on, but maybe we're not being so specific about the physical or spatial boundary in which we view them. But that's definitely something that would be very interesting to discuss in the webinar, is how are those differences between us in our different project groups. Certainly to understand how broad a spectrum of approaches we're going to have on this project between ourselves. Because this obviously will shape our planning for conducting that. If you're trying to take a much more spatially oriented approach, where you know that you're interested in a particular part of your town or your region, you maybe don't want to be too specific and pre-announce your arrival there, because maybe you are interested in more organically opening up understandings of what happens all day, every day in this area without you being there. And you're really just trying to be like a fly on the wall and see that neighborhood and to see the people that are there and strike up conversations with them or observe their behavior at a distance, versus those of us who maybe are looking maybe more in a workplace context, or those of us who have a much more specific idea of the types of individuals we would like to follow, but that getting access to those individuals is maybe going to demand a degree of planning and consultation with them, their carers, their managers, whoever they might be. So this is, like I say, quite a big difference in potentially how some of us are planning to approach our work. But at this stage, it's very much about making that distinction for ourselves. And it might be that we're conducting several observations, some of them more general, some of them more specific, some of them more spatially oriented, some of them more conceptually or user oriented. But that's very much a decision we need to make at this point in the planning process, because it will affect, obviously, our ability to do that work. So, like I say, there's probably many of you amongst us in this project who have much better experience than I from a qualitative research point of view, but observation as practiced by service design professionals draws very heavily on ethnography and anthropology as professional disciplines. And this concept from ethnography around making a distinction between, are we going in to observe people in their natural context with as few preconceptions as possible, and then see what bubbles out, what strikes us as interesting, what patterns of behavior we can observe, versus those of us who are going in with very preconceived ideas of what we're interested in and seeing if we can spot them in that environment, or seeing if that we can spot those things in people's behavior. This is a very big distinction that underpins practice in ethnography, and it's something that is also very relevant for us to consider, particularly with the very intangible nature of the concepts, like many that we deal with in social policy work. But it's sort of almost antithetical how one goes out and observes lonely people or people who are socially excluded, because by their very definition, those are people that are hard to observe. So I think defining who we're going to observe or what context we're going to observe, and also thinking a little bit about how this project has already begun to structure those ideas, is very, very useful at this point in the planning process, so that as you and your team get ready to go out and conduct the neighbourhood analysis, you're clear both about what it is you're actually looking for, or who the people are that you're actually looking for, or what patterns of behaviour you're interested in studying, versus leaving yourself open to be surprised, to learn things new, to see the things that you didn't expect to see. Another aspect of human behavior is that if we are focused in looking for certain things in particular, so if we've gone into a particular neighborhood looking for certain types of people or looking to spot certain types of behavior, it immediately shuts down our attention or our ability to see other things from that. We've gone in with a predefined idea. And that's absolutely okay. To be clear, there's no right or wrong answer in general when conducting these sorts of observation exercises, but particularly from what I can understand in relation to this project, it's not to say that one approach is better than the other. It's not to say one approach is right and the other's wrong. I think it's just about having an awareness of what it is we're actually interested in looking for, or who it is that we're trying to see when we go out and we conduct these neighbourhood analysis. But to sort of think a little further about that exact issue, we have been primed in this project to go into our particular neighbourhoods and to understand these preconceived concepts of social isolation, social exclusion, and loneliness, and to understand to some extent how the particular neighbourhood or the particular group of people we're interested in observing in that neighbourhood understand these concepts, or how their behaviour in these contexts can tell us something about social isolation or loneliness. As I've said already, observation is also a key way to test our own understanding of these concepts and our own assumptions about who is at risk of social isolation and loneliness, or how those people behave, or how we already in the public service delivery process or in the voluntary sector organisations, how we currently observe or understand those people and that topic. So as I've said in the other videos around this, it's really up to you in your individual context and in terms of the work that you've done already in the project to put the boundary around what type of users or which users you're either interested in going out to observe and deciding that before you do so, and then looking perhaps exclusively for those users in the neighbourhood, or whether you are interested in going out into the neighbourhood and seeing what you find, but then having a conceptual framework or idea of how you're then going to analyse what you find that helps you tie the observation back to the topic that we're supposed to be exploring. In more general service design activities, there are a number of other ways that you can help frame the observation and identify which people you're interested in observing. And one of those is known as typical users. So really from existing data or existing knowledge within your organization about who it is, who are your typical service users, and using that as the starting point to go out to look at who is currently using your service. So like I say, I don't know how many of you even work in service delivery organizations, but for those of you that do, I don't also know how many of you are planning to use your existing services as the starting point for conducting your neighbourhood analysis, to have a look, to go out and observe how your existing services are currently delivered and who is currently accessing them, with this additional lens or this additional perspective in the background that we want to be thinking about aspects of the problem of social isolation and loneliness as we go out and view this situation. And that may sound, incredibly underwhelming on some level. What would we actually gain from just going and looking at what's already happening with a little bit of this stuff in the back of our minds, or maybe actually something a lot more explicit in our minds about which type of users we're interested in, or what types of behavior we're interested in, or what parts of the social isolation problem we are most interested in understanding more about. But I wouldn't underestimate it. I think taking the time, if you work in a service delivery organization, or if you're just an interested person, and taking the time to go out and actually, even just in a conscious way, look at the people who are using your services more closely, can reveal all sorts of things that in the hustle and bustle of everyday life you don't usually have the time to notice or acknowledge. But like I say, I'm aware that for some of you that is not an applicable context to that which you're working in, or that which you're planning to conduct the eye-to-eye activity. So like I say, it's very much up to you as to whether this is an appropriate strategy for you. But it's certainly a very good place to start, as we discussed on the stakeholder mapping video, to start from the inside and work your way out, to start with the people that you already know or the context you already know, and to build on that as the project develops. An alternative approach to finding your most regular users or your everyday users is to find what's known as lead users or extreme users. So that's people who are maybe not representative but exist at the extremes. Now, how you define the extremes depends a little on the problem that you're looking at. And what's actually kind of interesting, this is a little bit of a meta reflection when you actually stop and think about this, that potentially in general, who we're looking for in this project are people who are at the extreme, people who are at the edge of society in generally. The socially excluded people are the ones who you don't see every day, perhaps have different reasons for why they aren't more visible in society, perhaps are very visible. I mean, obviously this is the other challenge with loneliness, you can't see it. So perhaps actually when you go out and you do observe a typical street in a typical town in the developed world or in any part of the world, you're potentially looking at lonely people everywhere you look, but you can't see them. So I think it is a very difficult, in some way, to actually conceptualize at a general level who it is we're looking for when we go out and conduct a neighborhood, who are ahead in adopting new technology as a way to understand behavior that then may help the mainstream adopt technology or adopt particular services. To perhaps identify people who are more extreme representatives of the particular risk factors that we're interested in this project. People who are perhaps advocates for those people already, who understand the issues at a much broader level than just representing their own individual opinion. And this is where obviously working with voluntary sector organizations around this topic can be very valuable, because they represent more than just the individual user. They represent a kind of broader spectrum of opinion. So I think if you are struggling to define who it is that you would be looking for when you go out and you conduct a neighborhood analysis, it's definitely worth spending some time discussing the issue and trying to build that picture, both by using the stakeholder mapping and the user profiling techniques we've already discussed, but actually beginning to have conversations with people who already are immersed in this issue and can perhaps point you in the direction of who some of those extreme users might be. So if you're looking for different ways to segment your observation and figure out who it actually is that you're interested in looking at, another one that could be valuable is to analyze based on job role. And that would be particularly true if you were going out in the manner that we tend to use this technique in Värmland. If you're going out and you're observing a particular service delivery context where your own organization is delivering a service in the hospital, for example, or in the public transport, that you can begin to identify the different users or the different people that you're interested in a particular context based on the role that they're performing, on the job role that they're performing. But this is something as well that potentially, depending on how generalized you want to be in your observation, you could begin to analyze a particular neighborhood or context based on different services that are being delivered. And I don't just mean public sector services, I mean private sector services. If you're going out into a street and you're looking at a street that has a supermarket on it, is there a delivery truck that's coming to deliver to that supermarket? Are there other services that are passing through that street? If the definition of someone of being socially excluded is someone who can't access those sorts of services or has challenges accessing those sort of services, potentially one of the ways that we can use the neighborhood analysis is to analyze what services already exist there that then maybe people who are socially excluded are not able to access. And then within that, which job roles or who is it in society that's performing those services? Who is it that's going into the supermarket? Who is it in the supermarket that's working there? And sort of taking this view of if those are the people who are out, and those are the people that are playing an active role in society, from a purely observational point of view, who's missing? Who haven't we seen? So like I say, that's just another way that this neighborhood analysis can perhaps be creatively interpreted, and the way that we can use purely observational approaches to understand the issue, but by looking at what roles are already being performed in society, as much as and who's missing from that picture, as much as going out and explicitly looking for certain types of people in certain types of situations. So in any case, whichever way you're choosing to interpret the requirements of the neighborhood analysis, observational approaches require that before you head out and start observing, you develop a rich picture already of the likely context in which you are going, so that you can begin to anticipate some of what's going to happen. But as I've said already, to do so with a slight hint of caution, because you don't want to be so focused on what you think is going to happen that you miss the unexpected. And really key to that is also approaching the situation with what we call a beginner's mind. So with a readiness to learn something new. So really the key sort of summary point to take away from all of this is that very much successful observation is about making your expectations explicit. And indeed, successful qualitative research very much depends on anticipating and making explicit what you think you will find, and then comparing the results when you actually go out and do it with that. So that's absolutely key, that when we're thinking about conducting our neighborhood analysis, that we've conducted some sort of hypothesis of who we think we'll find, or what their sorts of behavior are going to be, or who it is that will be excluded and that we won't see. And then really we're priming ourselves, we're getting ready, so that then when we go out, we've got a point of reference, that it's not just an overwhelming bombardment of new information when we go out. It will be that, particularly if we're taking this fresh perspective on what we expect to find, but that we have some reference point when we come back home and we begin to think about, well, what was it we learned or we gained from that experience? Really the key point is it's around what is different between what we thought we would find and what we actually find. And that is where the learning or the new insights or the creativity comes from, that will help us then build on that observational activity and turn that into something that's has the potential to be a new idea or a new service or a new product, or to reach a new audience in our neighborhood. So by this stage, we've hopefully got an idea of both who we're planning to look at, or what issues we're planning to go out and look for as we begin to think about our observation. But we also need to think about what our role is going to be when we're out there doing that. How are we going to behave? Are we going to be very passive, or are we going to be more active? And that obviously relates, as we've been discussing, to the type of problem that we're looking at. If we're basically going out in a street in your local town, and that we've chosen that as our neighborhood, it will be quite possible to be relatively passive, but still see plenty of things. Whereas if we're in a context that's a bit quieter, or where a workplace context, perhaps if our neighborhood involves observing existing services, perhaps we will need to play a more active role to be able to really understand what's going on. Perhaps the context will be so unfamiliar to us that we would need to have a more active role relative to those around us to really be able to gather any useful information at all. So this obviously points to the role of building relationships or building rapport with those people who are in the neighborhood that we're going out to observe. And this is a difficult balance because we don't want to be so familiar with those people that we're changing the dynamic in what we're observing. But it does involve people understanding why we're there and understanding why there's a strange person watching them enough and feeling secure enough with that person that they won't be inhibited in how they're behaving or the activities that they're undertaking. So I just want to talk briefly about a number of different models that you can adopt to help conceptualize this relationship and to help make this relationship a little easier, particularly for any of you who maybe don't have a lot of experience about doing this sort of work. And the first of those is what's known as the master and apprentice. So this relationship, and again, this is definitely more relevant again to a situation where you've got a much more specific idea of a type of behavior or a job role or a type of person that you're interested in observing and understanding more about. And they become the master. You are in their context, you are in their environment, you are in their neighborhood, and you want to be learning as much as possible from them. And that involves encouraging them to see themselves as the master, to develop enough of a relationship and a trust whereby they are able to show you what the neighborhood looks like, to show you the best spots to hang out in the neighborhood, to show you how a normal day in their work life looks. So they become the expert, and you are simply there to learn as much as possible. And the reason that the master and apprentice model works quite well is because there's then a degree of expectation on them to help explain things in sufficient detail that you could learn and that you could repeat that process with somebody else, that they're telling you enough information. You're not simply a passive observer in this context. You're not simply going in there and trying desperately to follow what they're doing or what they're saying or what their work process looks like. That they realize they need to stop and explain certain things, talk out loud as they're doing them, to help you understand what's going on and to basically begin to unlock a little bit more than just what you can see, but also a little bit about the internal workings of their mind as they walk through the neighborhood or as they go through a day's work. A slightly developed version of the master and apprentice model is known as the partnership model, where rather than them being the sole expert and talking out loud and narrating their experience for your benefit, you're given a role where you can ask deeper following questions about why they do things a certain way or why certain things are the way they are in the neighborhood. And this brings the boundary between what constitutes an observation and what constitutes an interview to the fore. Obviously, we'll come on and talk in more detail about what constitutes an interview from a service design point of view. But just to be really clear that if you're in the actual context in which someone is working or the people that you're interested in observing are operating, it is an observation. An interview is a dedicated process in a separate room away from the day-to-day work life or the day-to-day hustle and bustle of that neighborhood. But a partnership model, when it comes to conducting an observation, is one where you have a sufficient level of rapport or trust and a sufficient level of experience within the workplace or within the environment that you're observing to be able to more actively engage with the person who you are observing or the people that you're observing, to be able to ask them questions about, in a deeper way, why they're doing what they're doing or why things are the way that they are as you see them. So it might be, from your purposes, that takes a degree of trust building to facilitate, that it's not possible to go in straight away in a new neighborhood or in a new context and develop that sort of relationship with the people that work there or the people that live there. So it may be that that's something to work towards, or in terms of your planning processes, that you aim to start conducting a few more passive observations with the hope that over time you'll be able to develop working relationships with the occupants of that neighborhood that then enable you to develop this slightly deeper relationship and ability to interrogate why things are the way they are in a slightly deeper way. But as you're also beginning to think about planning your observational process and ready yourself to go out and conduct this neighborhood analysis, there are a number of sort of roles that you might want to avoid playing or take steps to prevent happening. The first of these is that of interviewer and interviewee. Now, this may sound a little contradictory to what I've been talking about, which is that it's good to be able to strike up a rapport and ask questions. But the main point of distinction here is that you do not want to be interrogating people that you're observing, and you do not want to be seen to be grilling people for information as you're conducting what's supposed to be an observation. It should be very much the case that you're observing them and that they're going about their normal work, or that they're demonstrating to you what a normal day looks like or what their neighborhood looks like. But it shouldn't be the case that you are letting the questions and your own desire to unpick what's going on underneath what you're observing and that getting in the way of them being able to conduct their normal routines. So that's the first key distinction, or first key role to avoid. The next is that of expert and novice. So you certainly want to build a level of rapport or a relationship with those around you to the extent that they don't see you as somehow superior or somehow expert, or that their interest in the project that you're conducting gets in the way of them behaving in a more natural way. You might need to obviously explain the project and explain your role and what you're doing here before you can observe them. But the important point is that they don't then spend the duration of the observation asking you lots of questions or deferring to your expertise when you're supposed to be there to understand their behavior and to learn more about their expertise. You're also not there to be Big Brother. It's not about criticizing the performance of the people you're observing, and you're not there to officially evaluate what they're doing. And I think, again, in a lot of contexts, people can be used to sort of formal evaluation or job role performance evaluation. So being at pains to kind of clarify that that's not the purpose of coming out today for you is valuable. The final role to avoid, and again, slightly counterintuitively given what we said about behaving respectfully and building a rapport with people, is that of the guest. You do not want them going out of their way to make you feel at home or make you feel comfortable. Now, obviously, social etiquette demands that that might have to happen at the start. If you're coming in to observe somebody's workplace, they're most likely going to offer you a cup of tea when you arrive, or a cup of coffee. Make sure you're comfortable and where you know where you need to go. But as soon as possible, once you are ready to go and once you are set up, you need to move away from them feeling like they have to accommodate you. And really, again, it should just be back to this being as natural and as normal a day in their life as possible, without them having to accommodate you in some way. So, as I said, this might be slightly different in a context whereby your neighborhood analysis is literally going out into the street and conducting a sort of ethnography of what's happening there, and something more organic, which for all the reasons we've previously discussed, be a perfectly valid way to begin the neighborhood analysis. But if you're instead thinking about conducting something maybe more typical to what we would normally do in a service design observation, whereby you're going into a more tightly defined space, a particular workplace or a particular service delivery context, chances are that the initial part of the observation will be a sort of introduction and setting yourself up and covering off some of the basics that will prevent what we've just been discussing happening. Basically making sure that all participants are comfortable, they understand why you're there, and that you're really emphasizing to them that you're shadowing them, you're following in their footsteps, and figuring out with them to what extent you'll be able to play an active role, or to what extent you already understand their workplace context, that you will need to play a more active role to be able to figure out what's going on, versus a situation where it may be more appropriate from either their point of view or for yours that you're there and you're observing, but that you're quieter, and that it's only in odd occasions that you would be interjecting and interrupting perhaps what they're doing to ask for more information. So we've talked a little bit about tasks already in the earlier videos. They're a fundamental way in which, in a service design context, we would tend to break down user behavior or understand what people are doing in a particular point in time, or in their use of a particular product or service. It might be harder or more difficult in yours and in relation to a more abstract concept such as social isolation or loneliness to identify initially what the specific tasks are that are of relevance to this question. But it could also be that one of the first tasks you've identified is how someone in the hospital environment maybe meets somebody in a care provider context, and really asking them what are their tasks or what is their process for assessing whether this person meets certain risk criteria. That may be also far too concrete, and certainly far more appropriate in a particularly medicalized context. That may not be appropriate to how you're thinking about framing this problem. But in terms of the general observation activity, it's beginning to think about what you're watching and what you're seeing, and how is that person or that professional structuring their work tasks, if it is a work task, or how is this person that you're observing going about their daily life in a particular neighborhood, that can be broken down into particular chunks of time or chunks of information that then are going to make them easier to analyze and make it easier to discuss with other people who are participating in the observation or other members of your project team, to be able to describe what actually is happening. Now, as we discussed a little earlier in this video, the main observation itself should be spent actually watching people doing the work, conducting those tasks that constitute their daily life, their interaction with a particular product or service, or how they go about their day job, how they go about navigating the neighborhood, doing their shopping, conducting daily tasks. And really, it's about letting them get on with that, remaining as unobtrusive as possible, only having to ask for clarification as and when you need it. And really, this should be the predominant part of the activity. Like I say, it can be, as time goes on, particularly if you're doing extended observation with people, that you do build a relationship with them. That means that it becomes more personal, and you become more in depth in terms of how you're talking to them or understanding the problem. But in general, and certainly as a safe way to start the process, it's to assume that you're not going to play a particularly active role in the process, particularly if you don't have existing deep understanding of what that activity or what that neighborhood actually is like, and that's what you're there to find out. Now, this can be both the topic of tasks that we've just raised and this sort of balance between being passive or active and what role you need to play can be a little difficult to understand, particularly if it's the first time that you've sort of conducted observation or if it's the first time in relation to this particular topic. And there are a number of frameworks that you can use to help sort of structure your observation and to make it a little easier to understand or break down the context that you're in, the neighborhood that you're currently observing, and to identify certain generalizable things that are actually happening as you observe. And one of the models that we use a lot in Värmland here is the AEIOU model. So that's looking at the different activities that are happening in front of you, looking at the environment that those activities are happening in, looking at interactions that people are having with each other or between people and the things that they're using, and then looking at those things themselves, looking at what objects are in this environment, in this neighborhood. And finally, who the users of those objects are in a little more detail. And sort of implicit in the way that I've introduced this topic is that we've sort of started with the users. We've maybe identified the environment or the neighborhood based on what sort of users we might expect to find there, because they'll be of interest to our inquiry. So these ideas of also looking for the objects or looking for the interactions between different actors in this environment is an additional level of detail that maybe isn't so relevant depending on how some of you are planning to structure your different activity. But in terms of supporting us from a design point of view, this idea of identifying what objects people interact with in the neighborhood or what places, if it's a slightly broader neighborhood analysis, if you are literally taking an entire neighborhood of a town, then maybe it's also about buildings and looking at the physical things that people are interacting with, as well as the other people that they're interacting with, are certainly some of the most useful insights that you tend to develop for then when it comes later in the process of analyzing that material, but also beginning to think about what it might be possible for us to change in that environment or in that neighborhood, or change the way that people interact with the environment, change the things that we've placed in that environment, and change the social processes or relationships that people have in that environment. They're all the sorts of things that we're interested in from a service design point of view, and all the sorts of things that as a service provider or as a service-oriented organization are what we use to deliver our services. So it can take some getting used to this approach, but hopefully the AEIOU is a reasonably memorable and catchy way and reasonably helpful way to help structure the complexity of what you might find in the particular neighborhood that you're observing. So there's another model, fairly similar in principle to the AEIOU, but from the design world known as Contextual inquiry model. So again, just another framework that potentially is of interest when we're thinking about how we can structure our approach to the observation and what sort of things we might want to be paying attention to when we're in a particular neighborhood. And the first factor, and it relates a little to what we've already discussed in the contextual analysis, is a focus on the tools that people use. And that can obviously be digital or physical tools, how people are interacting with their mobile phones being a very common one these days, what tools people are using in their work life, and then also a focus on the sequences of behavior. What are the order that certain things happen? Is it the same for multiple people that you've observed? Do they all use the same sequence of behavior when they're interacting with either physical devices, physical objects, or other people? Is the pattern of behavior the same every time you see it in this context? And what are those patterns? How are these objects and social behaviors organized? How do people structure their thinking around this sort of stuff? How do people approach certain tasks? Do people come to the bus station and purchase a ticket in the same way? What's the way that those patterns of behavior are being organized? And finally, what are the nature of the interactions that people are having in these neighborhoods? Is it predominantly social? Are they interacting with different buildings, different social activities? Are there particular places where people are interacting? What even constitutes an interaction? And I think that that's a very interesting question when in this project we're particularly interested in people who aren't socially interacting, and patterns of behavior that maybe lead to people at least feeling, in the case of loneliness, like they are missing social interaction. Is it the fact that there are plenty of other examples of other people being social that leads other people to feel lonely? And how can we observe these in the neighborhoods when we're going out to explore this concept? What are the things that people are interacting with in this space? So obviously, once you've been out and you've potentially been using some of these frameworks to help structure your observation, you've been out in the neighborhood, you've absorbed a lot of this information. There's a question of what happens next. It's obviously up to you to define how long you want to observe things for, and some of the potential neighborhoods or potential people or potential processes that you'll be observing will have their own implicit timescale attached to them. In terms of it will be relatively clear when time is up and when things are finished. But it might be, and again, just to bring up this distinction between what constitutes an observation or an interview, or when might be a good time to make that distinction, it could be, depending on the process, that it's good to follow the observation with a more detailed interview with the person that you've been observing or the people that you've been observing to help you understand more clearly what you've just seen. So all of this takes us as well to the question of how we're planning to record what we're observing, and whether we're planning to do that live while we're there, or whether perhaps the nature of the observation itself dictates that it is impossible to easily record. If we're out being given a guided tour around a neighborhood by a local person, it's perhaps not that easy to be taking notes simultaneously. There are a number of different solutions to this, and obviously using those structured frameworks that I've presented just a moment ago can help give a sense of what might be the most valuable things to record. One of the examples we would use is that you're taking notes as you're observing, and that you have a coding scheme for the different categories in the AEIOU framework, for example, and that you're basically taking notes in a notebook as you observe, with a little symbol or a little mark or a letter, in that case, to indicate what relates to what. So if you're observing somebody doing a particular activity, you might put an A in the margin, or if there's a particular object that's of interest, you might indicate that with an O, and that will just speed up the process of analyzing those notes. But what you might also want to think about is if there are several of you conducting the observation at any one time, having a meeting at the point at which you finish the observation to summarize what you've just seen, and to sort of download collectively the different perspectives that you might respectively have gathered as you're conducting the observation. The longer you tend to leave that, or even on your own, the more sort of individual that reflection becomes, the more likely it is that you forget things, or you miss certain points that others may have seen. So it's definitely, in terms of your planning and your thinking about how to conduct the neighbourhood analysis and your observation activity within that, it's definitely worth scheduling in not just potentially follow-up interviews with the participants immediately after to clarify certain behaviours or certain observations, but it's also worth scheduling in time yourselves to begin to take notes or share an understanding of what it is you've just seen. There are different schools of thought. Some people subscribe to the view that it's better to be more embodied, to be there in person, but not be worrying too much about taking notes or documenting that experience. And then there are other perspectives that certainly obviously highlight that it can be quite hard to recollect or to be specific about what you've seen if you aren't engaged in some form of documentation whilst you're doing it. You yourselves will need to decide, and it may also be the case, as I've mentioned already, that if in the early part of this project, in the neighbourhood analysis, and particularly given the fairly abstract nature of social isolation and loneliness, the fact that it is something that's not readily observed and it's a behaviour that's perhaps most commonly adopted by people you're least likely to see, means that you maybe need to conduct some more exploratory observations in the first stages, where you're really almost trying to understand the problem at a very high level. And maybe in that case, you don't need to be taking such specific notes, and it's a bit harder to use some of those frameworks because you don't quite know what you're looking for just yet. But you're using the process of observation and embodying that process to help you make sense of how this concept of social isolation and loneliness might apply in the particular neighbourhood you're exploring. So like I say, there's no easy answers around that, or indeed no easy answers around best practice here. But this is definitely something, along with any other questions or reflections that you yourselves might have, that we can take up and discuss in the webinar on the 13th of May.